So this sermon was actually inspired by a conversation I had with Shayna Hammer. We came down on different sides of a question about suffering. And then afterwards, I stewed and stewed, as I am known to do. And I've sat, by the way, in hospital rooms with other people. Some of you may be aware that Shayna has been in and out of the hospital multiple times, and I think she's currently in a rehab facility. But it's not just her who I think has suffered ridiculously. Others have also suffered. Others have been, and I've seen their face, and I've received their phone call when the doctor leaves with news that really nobody wants to hear. When they realize that whatever it is that they're dealing with, it's not quick recovery, it's not something that you can give them a shot of penicillin and 2 days later they're going to be out bouncing on the playground. It's more chronic. I myself, as some of you know, live in chronic pain. I lost the S-curve in my neck as a result of being rear-ended by that tractor-trailer truck, the gift that doesn't ever stop giving. And now live with slight aphasia. And I owe you guys an apology for forgetting the Janowski prayer earlier today, Avinu Malkeinu. I had the note, and my eyes just didn't see it, and then I forgot. So, and I've heard, by the way, from other people with kindness and love, who've said, God does not give you more than you can handle. Everything happens for a reason. We have these things happen, and they're there to make us stronger. Well, I'm going to say that whenever I've had that said to me, all I wanted to do in response is scream. I didn't ask to be made stronger this way. I didn't ask to not hurt. I didn't ask to have my life changed. Some of you in this very room this morning have also experienced similar things, where you have been told that you are just being challenged or tested by God, and yet what you're being challenged and tested by God with is almost more than anyone should bear. In 1942, we're going to take a time trip for a minute inside of the Warsaw Ghetto. Rabbi Kolumnus Kalmish Shapira, the Pesheshkno Rabbi, wrote these words as children were being rounded up for transport. When the person has been wholly crushed and squashed, there was no one left to rejoice. He knew all the teachings about suffering. He was, in fact, a famous teacher and scholar in the Hasidic movement. He had taught these teachings for many years. Yishurim Shel Ahava, afflictions of love. God refining you like silver, as it says in the Talmud, Brachot 5:8. No such torment has ever transpired previously in history, though he wrote in his notes regarding that passage. For old categories broke. And I want to share with you what our tradition actually does have to offer on suffering, but not just the type of suffering, not one of platitudes, not one of moments to make you feel better with some throwaway phrase so that the person saying it feels better, but leaves the person who's experiencing suffering just screaming. They don't place blame. Instead, they argue presence. Our rabbis debated this question, P.S., in case you were curious, across the centuries. And when I looked through the Talmud, I saw the answer that I think we're familiar with. The idea that suffering is an affliction of love, that God is refining you. But even in that conversation, as you know, the rabbis like to preserve minority voices. They like to preserve opinions that are not in line with the Stam Talmudic response. And in the end, the preservation of opinions in that conversation shifted the answer of why does suffering actually happen. 3 times we see great scholars who are asked a question about their suffering. Is the suffering dear to you? In other words, are you benefiting from this? Is it refining you? Is it making you better? Is it challenging you and pushing you to grow? Did you bring this on yourself? And 3 times each of these great rabbis said, no, neither it nor its reward. The tradition permits those great rabbis to scream at God, to not know why these things have befallen them, to refuse this tidy theology that we find often in our tradition. The Talmud goes on to say in response, there is suffering without iniquity. Some people suffer not because they have sinned. The tradition refuses in that moment to weaponize your pain against you. It refuses to blame the victim, as we so easily do today. Have you ever looked at someone struggling with addiction, with poverty, with a mental illness and thought, what did they do to deserve this? They've obviously done something wrong. Maybe they ate too many Twinkies. They're suffering from obesity. But that's not a great question. It's not a productive question. And it certainly doesn't help the person who's dealing with it. The Talmud then goes on to ask, why can't the sick rabbi heal himself? The answer is, a prisoner cannot free himself from prison. That's the theology. That's it. The prisoner cannot free himself. The person who's inside of that jail because of their illness, their suffering, their pain, whatever that may be, is there. And what they need is not a platitude because they can't free themselves. What they need, according to the rabbis, is our presence visiting them in their prison. Each time the rabbis respond, I don't want this suffering. And another rabbi extends his hand and lifts him up, hand clasping hand. Presence, not explanation, is what's called for. That doesn't satisfy you, which it may or may not. There's another answer in the Talmud, one more obscure than the first. It comes from Rabbi Ami, who once taught, there is no death without sin and no suffering without iniquity. Flies in the face, because don't forget the Talmud is not monolithic, which then brought on an entire other line of questioning, because those rabbis, who were familiar obviously with what was preserved in Brachot 5a, couldn't let that stand. And they challenged it, and they said something startling. That 4 completely righteous people did die. Not because of anything that they did, but because of Adam's sin. That's a little weird, you might ask. What did Adam do? And the phrase in the Talmud says, 4 died by the counsel. Arba meto ba'at-o shel nachash. But you can translate the word ba'at-o shel nachash from his counsel to the serpent's venom. It's a translation choice. By the way, when you look in Hebrew and there's no dots or vowels, translation choices give the reader this beautiful interpretive privilege. Rashi chose to gloss over this interpretation. He chose, by the way, to say counsel, by the advice of the servants. But I'm choosing venom for a homiletic image and a specific homiletic purpose. If we look and hear that because of the serpent's venom, Adam caused sin, I think it goes on to say that there is poison in this world even from the time of the creation, even from that moment that God made the Garden of Eden. And sometimes righteous people do in fact die from that venom. Sometimes people who did not sin or do anything are impacted by that venom. It's not some sort of moral poison or physical brokenness. It is simply a brokenness that exists in creation itself. And so let me tell you who those 4 individuals that the rabbis point to who were righteous. One was Benjamin, the son of Jacob, the one brother who never did sin in Joseph's story, though he did die young regardless. Avram, the father of Moses, righteous enough to raise Moses, Aaron, and Miriam, died anyway. Yishai, father of David, the ancestor of the Messiah himself. The proof test case where such wordplay on Nachash appears, died anyway. Kilab, the son of David, barely even mentioned in the Tanakh. Tradition says he died young and blameless. Even obscurity, though, doesn't equal guilt. None of these 4 people, tradition goes on to teach us, earned their death the way they died. They were righteous. I want to really drive this point home because this really flies in the face of the Deuteronomic liturgy and theology. The idea in Deuteronomy that we even read this morning, that righteousness brings blessing and sin brings punishment. We have heard that again and again and again. But the Talmud said not always. Not always is that true. There is inherited consequences sometimes and inherited guilt. Adam's sin brought death into this world, and these 4 people are proof of that. But not because they were morally responsible or irresponsible in their life. Simply sometimes I think this says that suffering can be systemic. It's not personal. We can at times be caught in a broken system. It's not your fault, but still you suffer the effects of that broken system. The cosmos itself, we learn from this, can be fractured if death entered via the serpent. Even the righteous, as many of us are at times, and sometimes not, live in a slightly fractured world. And the theodicy requiring distinguishing consequence from blame, because that's what this is. It's asking you to stretch your minds and recognize that bad things happen to you. It doesn't say that you did anything bad. It says that you can inherit pain. You can inherit guilt. Think about it. What this is saying, what this Talmudic passage is arguing, is that trauma is passed down through generations. Addictions run in families. Poverty at times is what we find ourselves born into. Violence that you witnessed as a child that had nothing to do with you. Systems that crush you before you can even speak. That is the brokenness. That's the serpent's venom still living in this world. Mortality and much fragility is baked into the creation at Eden. That's different from saying, you deserve this. This is tradition saying and refusing to blame you. It says that there is death without sin, that you didn't bring this on yourself. And the work now, the holy work, it's not to explain it. Rather, it's to stop the venom from spreading to the next person. You didn't cause it, but you can choose not to pass it on. That's agency. Who taught this, you may ask even further? As a Talmudic page goes back and forth. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, who elsewhere has even said Moses and Aaron has died for their sins, came back and said, maybe I wasn't always the case, meaning there's a contradiction in his own words. The Gemara's logic, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, who searched for sin in everybody, even he made a mistake. The Talmud teaches us. A great rabbi can be in error. If that's the case, requires humility from us. Learn from this. There is death without sin. There is suffering without iniquity. This is the conclusive refutation from that initial verse at the top of that conversation. You may ask, this may sound like original sin, obviously not a Jewish teaching, one from the early church fathers. But original sin says that we are inherently born evil. This is not saying that. We're still born B'Tselem Elohim, according to this theology. We are still created in the image of God. We are still inherently good. It is the sin that Adam committed that inherited guilt. That guilt was passed down. Judaism says Adam's sin, not the guilt, excuse me. It's the consequences which are passed down in Judaism, not the guilt. Death and fragility entered this world. 4 were sinless. No atonement sacrifice, though, was needed. Judaism distinguishes here consequence from blame. And I'll repeat that. Judaism distinguishes consequence from blame. You can have a horrible diagnosis. You can have horrible things happen just because there is venom in the world. You did not earn it. For the Pinsko Rabbi, when reflecting on this passage in his own very writings, he highlights that God is there, but there's not explaining, not justification, just a presence. There is no one left to rejoice, and yet he did not stop teaching. He could have stopped. He could have said, the theology is that God is absent, children are dying, my wife has died, my kids have died. But he didn't. He went looking for a different God. He turned to that Talmudic passage I cited in Chagiga 5b. And he said, my soul weeps in the hidden chambers within. The rabbis go on, does God weep? There isn't always strength to rejoice before God. Because sometimes in the outer chambers where we exist, we can't always rejoice. We are sad. And sometimes in that moment when we are sad, God is weeping inside, God is hiding God's own face. He went to say, at a time of Hester Panim, when God's face is hidden, a Jew may enter the inner chamber and be alone with God there. Within the inner chamber, Torah and worship are revealed. So when you're in that place, when you cannot rejoice, and God is crying, that's your time to go and find God in the inner chamber. It's not the God who tests you. This is not the God who refines you. This is the God who weeps with you as you weep. This Rebbe died in 1943, but before he died, he left us a map. When all theology collapses, when you are crushed beyond your ability to pray, you can still meet God in that inner chamber, and God and you can weep. I can't go to that spot, but you can. We all can individually, because that's that place between you and God. But I can tell you, collectively, God's hand stays outreached even when we are sad, even when we are crying, even when we don't feel God's very presence. And we can become a hand, reaching back toward God and reaching out toward one another. A prisoner cannot free himself from prison. The prison, that illness, that grief, that trauma, whatever's holding you captive. It was different rabbis who reached out and lifted those sick rabbis up out of that place of pain. Some of you are in the inner chambers this morning, feeling God's presence shining his face on you or her face. And some of you, on the other hand, are in that inner presence, feeling absolutely crushed, living with pain you didn't cause, trauma, addiction, poverty, violence, an unsettling diagnosis, or loss. The serpent's venom is still in this world. You are living in its wake. We all are. The tradition refuses, though, to blame and refuses to leave you alone. The Pinsko Rabbi, Rabbi Kalanamas Kalma Shapira, found God weeping. He was 44 years old when the Nazis shot him in the Tornanki labor camp in 1943. Unfortunately, we have no grave for him, no remains. Before he died, he wrote, "A Jew may enter the inner chamber and be alone with God there." After the war, people came through the Warsaw Ghetto and dug up bins where his teaching remains. May his words sit with us this morning. The words, "We will meet you there. We will lift you up."